Okay, we're back. I just took like a 5-minute break to save that, convert the M4A recording to an MP3, drink a bit of Fanta, which I don't even really like, by the way. I prefer water. Water is a goated fluid. I fucking love water. But I bought like a big ass 2-liter bottle in order to store water. And it turns out that the Fanta was in the bottle because you can't just go to Tesco and like buy bottles. So I'm just drinking the Fanta. So if my tummy is a bit upset, then do forgive me. No, my tummy's fine. My tummy's having a great time. Now, let's look at another. God, I'm a bit tired. I've been talking for an hour. Yo, I haven't even eaten today. I just woke up and started recording. God, that makes me sound like a massive psychopath. I just really want to do it. I want to do it, guys. I really want to yap about this kind of stuff. I love doing it. But I should eat, shouldn't I? Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna eat food. And then I'm gonna be back. Hold on. Okay, we're back. So I took a break. I made myself a little burger. I went to a careers fair for my uni, and now I'm back. We're back. We're ready to talk about communism again. So we talked about this kind of tripartite definition of ideology as having this economic, political, and social-cultural component. Let's look at the political component. So in communism, how can political power be used? Who gets political power? What can it do? What can't it do? What's the legitimate use of power in a communist society? Now, again, there's a massive divergence here between the original theory of communism as formulated in the 1800s, comprising the definition of communism as it really is, and what states in the 1900s did in the name of communism. Real communism is a fundamentally libertarian ideology. It is a far libertarian ideology. Remember that axis of libertarian versus authoritarian? It's far to the libertarian end. The only other ideology which is further on the libertarian end is anarchism. More about in the future. Real communism is fundamentally libertarian, egalitarian, and democratic. And it's based on universal suffrage. That's a really key thing. Because at the time Marx was writing in the early 1800s, there was, like, societies like Great Britain did have some degree of democracy, but it was far from universal suffrage. Like, only a single-digit number of percentage of people in society were allowed to vote. So this is not only what Marx persistently advocated. Marx persistently called for a democratic society established by the people, as in the working class. And by the way, it's important to note that one of Marx's key theories was that the kind of middle class as we understand it, not the grand bourgeoisie, but the kind of teachers and professionals and very skilled workers, that group of people, Marx predicted that capitalism would slowly squeeze out that group of people, and that these people would a few of them would find their way into the bourgeoisie, as in the upper middle class, but most of these people would slowly be squeezed into the working class around this time. So when Marx talked about the working class seizing power, he did mean the people. He meant like 97, 98, the overwhelming majority of society here. So when Marx talks about a bottom-up approach of the proletariat taking power and dispossessing the bourgeoisie, he meant essentially the entire populace, apart from a few percentage points of elites. The whole ethical ideal of communism, though, is based on freedom and equality. The whole point of communism is to establish a free and equal society of individuals. The whole point of communism is as a reaction to authoritarianism. Communism looks at capitalism and says, in this world, even if some people have the right to vote, it doesn't matter. You're not really in control of your life if you're a wage slave working in a factory and you need that job, otherwise you starve to death in the street. The whole point of communism is to give power to people. That was the original motive force behind communism. The whole point of communism is establishing a society wherein the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That is a quote. I'm not actually sure from whom. I think that's a quote from Karl Marx, but I'm not entirely sure whether that's the case. Every conception of communism as it actually is, by the way, I'm not talking about the later kind of bastardizations of it. For example, Marxism, Leninism, or Maoism, or whatever. I mean, in that umbrella term of communism, but actual communism as formulated in the 1800s in the West, mostly in the West, every definition of communism to fall under that umbrella, as I've said, has a common ends, they just disagree on the means. It's always been based on popular sovereignty and the power of the common man. It's always based on wrenching power from a small elite, whether that be a landed aristocracy or a bourgeoisie, and giving it to the common man. Marx himself constantly talks about communism being established through a bottom-up process. The idea is that the workers, the proletariat in the country would spontaneously organize. They'd form unions, they'd form councils, they'd form, by the way, the USSR is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A Soviet is just the Russian word for a workers' council. So initially in the Russian Revolution, what happened was that the workers in Russia did actually spontaneously establish these Soviets, or these councils, especially, I think this process was much more limited in the countryside, but in cities like Petrograd or St. Petersburg, this is kind of what spontaneously happened, and that these Soviets, these powers, these councils were democratic organizations which instituted power. And in fact, initially after the Russian Revolution, when the provisional government was set up, that provisional government shared power with these Soviets. And parties like the Mensheviks or the SRs were in favor of actually decreasing the power of the provisional government and giving more power to the Soviets. It was the Bolsheviks who emasculated both the central government and the Soviets and established themselves as in their political party as the one source of power in Soviet Russia. But the point is that Marx himself talks about these spontaneous work organizations establishing power to establish universal suffrage and end any kind of autocracy, oligarchy, any kind of non-democratic form of government, because the idea behind communism was to end any form of coercion in society, and any form of government which is not democratic, by that definition, is coercion, because you're being forced to do something. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as the law, but if the law is established by the people as a whole, then that's something that communism finds acceptable. What's unacceptable is if the law is dictated to people by a group which is not fundamentally the people. So communism, in a political science definition, cannot be authoritarian by definition, because it rejects any kind of hierarchy, any kind of authority, indeed any kind of social classes. But even within the actual definition of communism, remember how I said there's variation? There's some controversy on the means to establish the end. Because there's variation, it still means that some forms of communism are more authoritarian than others. Even though all constituent elements of that communist umbrella are on the libertarian side of the spectrum, some are very far libertarian, some are less far libertarian. Because Marx, for example, and many other socialists, and classically anarchists as well, and we're going to get onto anarchism next episode. I know I've said it a million times, and I'm always like, we're going to get to anarchism next episode, but we will. And we're going to give that topic the weight that it deserves. Now, Marx advocated a bottom approach. Many people did. But many communists, for example, Blanqui, who I mentioned earlier, and crucially, Lenin, advocated a different approach. They advocated for a top-down approach. Now, Lenin is a bit different because there's lots of debate as to what Lenin's real motives were. Personally, I'm not at all convinced by the actions of Lenin that he really wanted a free and equal association of individuals. I think all of Lenin's actions, for example, emasculating democracy, centralizing power, establishing a secret police, his brutal policies of war communism which caused famines of millions, I don't think these are in any way compatible. I don't think these in any way indicate that the end goal of Lenin was the same as the kind of original communists in the 1800s. I say original communists, I mean the people who contributed to that original theoretical formulation of communism. But even other communists, like for example, Auguste Blanqui. I could give a little bit of like a French zest to a little Auguste Blanqui. But even some of these people may have shared that same, I'm just using Blanqui as an example. I actually don't know whether Blanqui was like Lenin and had a different end in mind. I'm just using him to say that some communists advocated for a top-down approach. They believe in creating a disciplined party. So a political party, for example, are then using that to drive the revolution forward, to lead the people. This is to form, i.e., the vanguard of the revolution. So this approach is often called a vanguardist approach. And in the vanguardist approach, the state is used as a tool to establish communism. The vanguard, the political party, seizes power of the machinery of the state and then manipulates that machinery to establish communism. And then once that is done, the state is allowed to wither away. So theoretically, this is compatible with what communism is. Because even what Marx was talking about how the state withers away in time, even Marx conceded that in order for that first to happen, some use of political machinery has to be operated in order to establish lower stage communism. So this vanguardist approach isn't necessarily incompatible with real communism. In practice, though, it has been. I mean, it's just never really happened. I mean, all the communist states in the 20th century were established by a vanguardist approach, and every single time it just established a dictatorship. And in fact, these criticisms were posed to Marx. There's a debate between Marx and someone else, where that someone else basically says, if you have a group of people and they seize power and they're in control of the state, what's to stop them from just holding on to power? And Marx basically dismissed it and was just like, that wouldn't happen. And, it did. And in fact did. Many, many times. In fact, every single time. That is what happened. So, the whole vanguardist approach, it seems that the lessons of history seem to tell us that it's not compatible. At least it's not compatible because all the countries in which this communist revolution happens are countries where there weren't strong democratic institutions beforehand. It may be different if you have a country such as, Switzerland, where the entire institutional fabric of the state is kind of anchored towards democracy, and where there's a long history of democracy. It may be that a vanguardist approach is more successful there. I'm not sure. Personally, and this is my opinion, I think it's unlikely. I think the lessons of history and human psychology tell us that if you have a group of people and you give them unchecked power, they will just hold on to that power. And that has in fact happened every single time. Now, what is important to note is that Marx often talks about this concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx talks about this constantly as being this kind of necessary thing to establish in order to effect the transition to communism. Now, what that's really important to note is that the dictatorship of proletariat in Marxist lexicon, and indeed in the discussion of most of these communists in the 1800s, the dictatorship of the proletariat was not understood as being the dictatorship of a party or the dictatorship of an individual. It was rather, the idea was that society as a whole would be controlled by the proletariat. This class of the proletariat, before, as Marx said in End Stage Communism, when all class distinctions withered away, before that happened, the proletariat would seize power and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. However, in a society where the proletariat comprises 95% to 100% of the population, what this means in practice is democracy. It's just contrasted with a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, where, for example, in a country like England in the 1830s or the 1840s, so the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. Now, at that time, the only people in Britain who could vote were the upper class, the aristocracy, and the upper middle class, i.e. the bourgeoisie. So that situation when one class, or rather, in this case, two classes, but the point is that Marx is trying to make is that the elite had a monopoly on political power. That situation would be contrasted with the dictatorship of the proletariat, wherein the people would have a monopoly the people would have a monopoly of political power. So this wasn't meant to be one party rule. Marx did not condone the Bolshevik seizure of power. And I'm using the Bolsheviks as a example here because it's just it's the quintessential example, isn't it? And the Russian Revolution was really a defining event of the 1900s in the same way that the French Revolution was kind of the defining event of the 1700s and of the long 19th century. The long 19th century, by the way, it's a historiographical period between the French Revolution, 1789, and 1914, the outbreak of World War I. Now, another thing to talk about the kind of political aspect of communism. Unlike socialism, there's lots of reformist schools of socialism. Schools of thought which basically say that we don't need to establish socialism through a revolution. We can establish it through gradual reform. Now, communism, basically all schools of communism, legitimate or otherwise, talk about communism being established through a revolution. Now, Marx himself did concede that potentially it could maybe be done through bourgeois democracy. Maybe. But the rhetoric and the ethos of communism is revolutionary. And indeed, even the thinkers in the 1800s, so putting the 1900s actual revolutionaries aside, even in the 1800s, the communists who actually advocated for real communism, i.e. the political science definition of communism, even these people favored a revolutionary approach. But the whole point that Marx was saying was that revolution should be initiated from the bottom up. by the workers to establish democracy, not from the top down by a narrow group of people to establish their own hold on political power. So the fundamental concern here, again, the fundamental concern in communism is agency, it's autonomy. It's about creating a society wherein the individual is free to do what they would like to do. This is not compatible with authoritarianism. It's not compatible with autocracy or oligarchy or any kind of state in the 1900s. The idea of relinquishing freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, which is what all these communist states did in the 1900s, would have been shocking to communists in the 1800s because that's what they were fighting against. They were trying to establish a society wherein these basic freedoms and rights were given and could not be messed with. The whole point of communism was the empowerment in the individual and a constitution which actually pursued the goals of liberalism. We're going to get to liberalism later, don't worry. Which means that, communism in the 20th century violently contradicted this. The Soviet Union, again, it's the classic example, but Lenin himself personally interpreted the dictatorship of the proletariat as being the rule of a vanguard party, which is just not. And again, I'm making really clear this massive divergence between 1800s communism and 1900s communism, because the communism in practice that we see in the 20th century really did just blatantly contradict the entire point. Like, it did the exact opposite of what these people were fighting for. So, and again, that kind of conceptualization of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that twisting of the idea of dictatorship of the proletariat involving a vanguard party it didn't start with the Soviet Union and Leninism. There were revolutionaries such as Blanqui in the 1800s who were advocating that kind of approach early. And also with the whole idea of a vanguard party. So in the Soviet Union, the idea of elections, so when the Bolsheviks held elections, they didn't hold elections to actually express the will of the people. The idea was to show the people what they were meant to do and meant to think. Hence all the elections that actually took place in the Soviet Union were just complete shams, obviously, because the aim was not to actually give the people voice, which is the complete opposite of what the whole point of communism was. So from this bastardization, we get the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and all the kind of daughter ideologies of Marxism, Leninism. So all these kind of communist ideologies in the 1900s that were based off of or inspired by the Soviet Union, but kind of went their own way. So like Yugoslavia or China, for example. And all of these daughter ideologies, all the ideologies of communism in the 1900s, by the way, when I say communism in the 1900s, I mean the communist states. I don't mean communist theorists in the 1900s, because there were many communists in the 1900s who remembered that political science definition, that ideal of communism, and still advocated for it. It's not as if the definition of communism itself changed. It's more that people started to associate the word communism with communist states, rather than the definition of communism. So that's what I mean. That's just something to keep in mind. So all of these communist states in the 1900s were fundamentally one-party dictatorships based on the state ownership of means of production. Not society owning it, not the actual workers owning it, certainly not the whole community owning it, but the state owning it. And utilizing central planning and parroting Marx whilst ignoring all of his actual beliefs. In fact, ironically, during the 1930s, the totalitarian Stalinist USSR denounced social democracy in Europe as being social fascism because it impeded the dictatorship of the proletariat. So at the very time when fascism was taking place, and this only started changing once in the early 30s, the USSR was like, oh shit, we actually need to team up with these guys. But before that, imagine it's like the early 30s, you're in Germany, the Nazis are gaining power, you're thinking, holy shit, everything's on fire. You're a leftist trying to establish an actual democracy, and all this time, the totalitarian Stalinist USSR is calling you fascist. It's, you see the hypocrisy, you see the contradiction between communism as the ideal and the communist states of the 1900s. However, there were communists who in the 1900s saw what was going on in the USSR and explicitly condemned it. We talked about how in Russia and then later on in Europe in the kind of 20s and the 30s and the 40s, we had left communists, so people who defined themselves in opposition of the Bolsheviks, who stated that they were being closer to Marx's actual teachings. And in fact, there's lots of Marxist schools of thought. So remember how we talked about how there's lots of different interpretations of Marxism, lots of different schools of thought. There's an umbrella term called libertarian Marxism, which is a Marxist school of thought, not necessarily not always, not always socialist or communist per se, more Marxist. So based on the teachings of Marxism. So libertarianism, Marxism is when you take the political philosophy of Marxism and you take a revolutionary and bottom-up approach. So libertarian of Marxism is a reading of Marxism which emphasizes Marx's own support of bottom-up democratic approaches. So libertarian Marxism is itself part of a larger umbrella term, libertarian socialism. Now remember how I said earlier that like socialism is sometimes used as an umbrella term to include both communism and anarchism and socialism and sometimes social democracy? That's the meaning of this term libertarian socialism here. So libertarian socialism, so libertarian Marxism is a derivative of libertarian socialism. And the whole point of libertarian socialism is that it rejects the state ownership of means of production and is very much libertarian. So anarchism, for example, is a classic example of libertarian socialism. Again, more on anarchism in the next episode. Have I mentioned it before? Have I mentioned we're talking about anarchism in the next episode? Yeah, we are. We'll be talking about anarchism next episode. So a type of libertarian Marxism, just as an example, is called council communism. And in council communism, the government and the economy is managed by workers' council. So there's a decentralized planning, and the whole form of the state is that rather than having one massive central authority, there's lots of horizontally organized workers' councils that make up the country. And all these workers' councils, they elect representatives, so it's a representative democracy, but all these representatives can be recalled immediately. So in democracies in the West, you do elect representatives, but you personally as a voter do not have the power to immediately recall them. For example, in the UK, the legislator can conduct a vote of no confidence, but they can stay. So William Pitt, for example, in the late 1700s, lost a vote of no confidence and then just stayed in power. The point is that even in modern democracies, you elect representatives. Oh, Donald Trump is a great example. Donald Trump was elected in 2016. At no point could the voters then say between that and 2020, actually get out. But in libertarian socialism, the idea is that all representatives are immediately recallable. So libertarian Marxists basically believe that if you have a revolutionary vanguard and a top-down approach and central planning, all that leads to is authoritarianism and bureaucracy. You have one small group of people consolidating power over the whole country and just creating a massive civil service designed to serve the central government, which, as it happens, was a correct forecast. And in fact, so in the first international, so in the late 1800s, when international communist meetings started being held for the first time, anarchists were really famous, were just such vehement proponents of the idea that the top-down approach would lead to authoritarianism that anarchists actually got kicked out of the first international by the Marxist faction. So it's just worth mentioning. I bring up council communism because it seems to me, based on what the political science definition of communism actually is, that council communism is true to the original idea of communism. And counter-communism, very similar to anarcho-communism. And anarcho-communism is when you have the social, cultural, and political ideology of anarchism, but the economic system of communism with decentralized planning. Again, we're going to be talking about anarchism later. So, let's talk about this final ideological component. So the final component of an ideology, and the final, remember we diffracted that